Hey, and welcome, gurus, to this lesson, Front Door Routing Rules. I'm Chase, one of your Azure training architects here at A Cloud Guru, a Pluralsight company, and it's in this lesson that we're going to get a little bit more in depth with the components of Azure Front Door, specifically routing rules, which is what makes all of the magic happen. To do this, we're going to cover some mapping of the Azure Front Door terminology so that we understand and have a common definition of the different components that we're talking about. Then we're going to describe what routes are, and then we're going to break down those routes, and then we'll review the routing architecture and the order of operations that take place when traffic comes through our Azure front doors and how it makes it to the appropriate backend resources. And then we're going to deconstruct the rules engine that is used by Azure Front Door, and then we'll take an overview look at our rewrite rules, which should be pretty familiar to us, having already done Azure Application Gateway in a previous section. And then we'll wrap up this lesson with some key takeaways. So to map our terminology, we'll use this Azure Front Door architecture. When you hear of an Azure Front Door, you'll commonly hear it referred to as an instance of Azure Front Door or an Azure Front Door profile. And all this means is that it is your substantiation of the Azure Front Door service. And then with Azure Front Door's components, you'll hear your front end commonly referred to as a front end endpoint or a front end domain. And that's the, Azure provided x.azurefrontdoor.net or those custom domains that you configure with your Azure front end endpoint. And these are those domains, those hosts that are available via those points of presence or edge locations, depending on what you'd like to call them, that are being anycast IP'd to be able to serve up your front end to those end users in various locations across the globe. Then all of that is routed, of course, to our backend pool, commonly referred to as an origin group now in the new SKUs of Azure Front Door, where we have those backend targets or origins within that origin group. And the other final component of Azure Front Door that actually routes the traffic from the front end endpoint to the origin group and origins inside of it is the routing rule, which really had been commonly referred to in the past as routes and the rule sets. But our routing rule is that all-encompassing name for the new SKUs of Azure Front Door. So this is the mapping for our terminology when we're talking about routing. And it's important to understand the terminology so that whenever we're talking about routing traffic from a front-end endpoint to an origin group using a routing rule, we all understand what it exactly is that we're talking about. So to dive a little bit deeper, now that we have a mapping of the terminology, we're going to briefly review the components so that we can understand what routing rules are. We have that front-end, which is that front-end host, domain, or front-end endpoint, whichever you'd like to call it, where traffic will be directed to our web solution. We have that backend pool or those origin groups with their origins that are going to service those requests to our web application running behind Azure Front Door, and that routing rule, which is going to route traffic and connect those front ends to those origin groups. And it's also going to provide the different features inside that routing rule, such as the accepted and forwarded protocol, the caching content settings, and the URL path forwarding, as well as those rule sets that we have enabled, such as rewrite rules or redirection. Now, to break down those routes, we're going to again pull back up our architecture here with our front end endpoint, our origin group, and our routing rule. For a routing rule, I find it's easiest to think about everything as left-handed or right-handed. So left-sided or right-sided based on what side of the routing rule we're on. On the left side of the routing rule, we have that incoming match that we're listening for, that we're trying to identify, such as that custom domain name and maybe even a URL path. Then we have that right side where we are actually routing that data to the origin group, and we have things like the cache content settings and the forwarded protocol. Now, the different components on each of these is slightly different, but in the incoming match, what we have is that HTTP or HTTPS accepted protocol that we're listening for, the host that we're listening for, and like I said, the URL path in path-based routing. Then on the route data side of things, on the right-hand side of the routing rule, we have that forwarded protocol, HTTP or HTTPS, if we want to have that end-to-end encryption. The cache content settings, the origin group and origin we're trying to send this traffic to, where we're trying to route it. And then those rule sets that we create so that we can do things like rewrite rules and redirection, so we can determine whether or not we want to send this to a different origin group should a certain if-then criteria be met. Now, the routing architecture follows a specific order of operations here. Azure Front Door Classic Vanilla SKU would have taken us down the path of connecting to the edge, matching to front door, and establishing that TLS encryption between the front door if we're using an accepted protocol of HTTPS, for example. And then we have the evaluation of those WAF rules that we have on our web application firewall. Then we have matching routing rules to determine which routing rule is actually listening for the front end that has been requested by the client. And once that happens, then we evaluate that rules engine, those rule sets that we have configured on that routing rule. And then the cache content settings are evaluated and whether or not to cache content. And then we select a backend, right? One of those resources in our origin group, and forward that request to that origin group. With the standard and premium v2 SKUs, it's a little bit different, but it's pretty close to the same. We connect to the edge, we match to front door and establish that accepted protocol on the front end. We evaluate web application firewall rules. We match a route based off of whichever front end host we're listening for. And then we evaluate our rules engine, which are, again, those rules that we have on the routing rule itself. Then we evaluate what content will be cached, what those content caching settings are set to. And then we select an origin group or origin to forward that request to. And then the traffic is then sent back to the client. Now, at this point, what we're going to do is dive a little bit deeper into deconstructing that rules engine. So in our Azure Front Door architecture here, when we're evaluating rules, again, as we saw, we first evaluate those web application firewall rules. And then after that comes evaluation of the rules engine. And the rules engine uses this if-then logic to match conditions and then take an action upon that condition. So we might match if a condition is true or match if a condition is false. And this rules engine component is actually part of that routing rule. These are configured on the routing rule so that we can have that if-then logic to make decisions. For example, if a condition is true, send it to an origin group. And if the condition is false, send it to a different origin group. So it's really this rules engine that allows us to provide intelligence the way that we route traffic to our origin groups using a routing rule. Now, quickly, we're going to overview our rewrite rules. This is very similar to what we have with Application Gateway, where we can use URL rewrite to rewrite things like a path. For example, if the path is foo, rewrite to bar. We can also do URL redirection in the rules engine to be able to move traffic through the route based off of if it's x.com, route it to y.com. And we can also do things like restructure our URLs entirely. We can restructure the protocol, we can restructure the domain, we can restructure the path, we can restructure things like the query string. We have all of these options using the rewrite rules to be able to reconstruct our URLs to be able to forward traffic to appropriate origin groups to ensure that traffic reaches the intended destination. All right, gurus. Now at this point, we're going to wrap up this lesson with some key takeaways. First and foremost, understanding routes is the most important thing to take away from this lesson. Routes are what gets that traffic from that front end endpoint, that domain name, to our backend resources, so those origin groups. And we have a default route that we use to be able to get that traffic through. Now, we also have to think about routes in the left side and right sided of that route. We have that incoming traffic, and we have the right side of that traffic where we're actually routing that data to the origin group. The items that might impact these routes are things like our web application firewall rules that we have out there for our edge locations protecting our Azure Front Door profile. We also have those rules engines which are going to be evaluated from the edge before we make that routing decision. And then we have those default routes and rewrite rules and redirections that are in our routing rules that might impact where traffic is going. Now, before we close this lesson, I just want to make sure that we leave off with a good understanding of the mapping of the terminology for Azure Front Door. When you hear front-end endpoint, what we're really talking about is that domain, be that the Azure Front Door provided or custom domain. When you hear origin groups, what we're talking about is something that we've commonly referred to with other load balancing solutions as the backend pool of resources. And then when you hear of origin, what we're talking about is a specific resource in that backend, commonly referred to in previous load balancing solutions as a backend target. Then when you hear routes, what we're really talking about are those routing rules that are making those routing decisions on where to forward our request. And then when you hear instance or profile, what we're talking about in terms of Azure Front Door is our substantiation of the Azure Front Door service. And finally, when you hear of points of presence or edge locations, what we're talking about is those entry points into Microsoft's backbone that are closer in proximity to our end users so that we can service their requests from those end locations and cache content there. All right, Gurus, that's all my time for now. Thanks so much for joining me in this lesson, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.